doing? Come on. No. Good to see you. Good afternoon and welcome to the Wilson Center. Special welcome to our keynote speaker, Ambassador Charles Rees. I'm Mike Van Dusen, the Chief Operating Officer for the Center. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan public-private institution created by an act of Congress. It serves as the official national memorial to the 28th President. We tackle global issues through independent research and open dialogue, providing a trusted and neutral space and developing new frameworks for understanding problems that can lead to actionable ideas for policymakers. We're delighted to partner today with the RAND Corporation and hope that this session can lead to further Wilson Center RAND collaboration both here in California. Today's session will highlight the important recent study that RAND did on the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and what it might ultimately mean for Afghanistan. Our keynote speaker, Ambassador Rees, is Vice President of International Work at the RAND Corporation, where he oversees RAND's growing international presence while continuing work in his lane of excellence, the economics of development. While on leave of absence from RAND in 2010, Ambassador Rees was Executive Vice President of the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund. Ambassador Rees has had a career in the Foreign Service that spanned 3 decades, including important capstone service in Iraq and a previous service as Ambassador to Greece. He's been with the RAND Corporation close to 5 years. Ambassador Rees will speak about the RAND report that is the subject of today's meeting for roughly 10 minutes, after which Tara McKelvey of BBC News will moderate a panel discussion, leaving equal time for questions from the audience. Hearty welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Rees.
Thank you very much, Mike, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Special thanks to Wilson Center. We hope this is the first of many collaborations between RAND and Wilson. In November 2008, the United States and Iraq signed and the Iraqi Parliament approved 2 watershed agreements. These were known as the United States-Iraq Security Agreement and the Strategic Framework Agreement. The security agreement provided for the end of major U.S. combat operations by October 2010 and the complete withdrawal of U.S. military forces by the end of 2011. The framework agreement set out the principles and objectives for U.S.-Iraqi relations going forward and now. When we signed these agreements, we committed ourselves to the largest transition and withdrawal of American forces from an ongoing conflict since Vietnam. Serious, detailed planning for the complex, difficult tasks involved began in 2009 and continued almost up to the day, December 18th, 2011, when the final units crossed the Kuwaiti border, ending the U.S. war in Iraq. At the invitation of the U.S. command in Iraq, a team of RAND analysts studied how American policymakers, military officers, diplomats, and Iraqis approached the task of winding down the U.S. presence in the country, how the military transitioned the tasks and responsibilities that they had undertaken to civilian leads. And this was undertaken in phases over many years. The idea was to learn lessons applicable to undertaking such a gargantuan task in the future, and most immediately the anticipated withdrawal of U.S. forces, bulk of U.S. forces, from Afghanistan in 2014. Dr. Rick Brennan, who's spent 5 years in Iraq as an embedded RAND analyst, and I were privileged to lead the team. But as you can see from our list of co-authors, many of whom are with us here today, on this project we had a range of RAND analysts with complementary skills. So ending the U.S. war in Iraq posed many difficulties once the political decision was made to do it. The security situation was unsettled, to say the least, although in 2009 it was much better than it was in the tougher years of the Civil War, 2006, 2007. We had helped Iraq in improving governance and in rebuilding its security forces. Yet much training and equipping of Iraqi forces had not been completed. Iraq's security was still dependent on major U.S. enabling support in intelligence, logistics, air power, and many other aspects of modern warfare. Iraq's political transition and reconciliation were not yet complete. We didn't know what would be required to set up an embassy in Baghdad to succeed in such a hostile security environment without military support or protection. And crucially, while we were committed in the security agreement to withdraw all forces, we really didn't know about what the military calls the end state. That is to say, whether or not there would be follow-on U.S. troop presence on the ground that would continue training Iraqi forces. Neither the United States nor the Iraqi government had a clear position on the desirability of a follow-on presence when transition planning began. No textbooks guided planners through the complexities. With some guidance from Washington, some false starts, and a lot of effort in the field, a plan came together and was set into motion. But during the 3 years leading up to the transition, the gap between U.S. strategic goals for Iraq and the means to achieve them widened. If the United States had conducted a fundamental reassessment of its Iraq strategy in light of agreed upon departure of the U.S. forces, it might have flagged this mismatch. But such a strategic review was not undertaken, leaving the U.S. military and embassy leaders with the challenge of seeking to achieve overly optimistic strategic policy goals with insufficient resources. Starting in July 2011, U.S. forces in Iraq began the process of departing, and in October 2011, military forces began operational maneuver out of Iraq. 50 bases were closed, including 7 large bases and logistical hubs. USFI hauled out 1.8 million pieces of equipment, moving 20,000 truckloads through Kuwait, Jordan, and Turkey. Simultaneously, approximately 50,000 military personnel and more than 56,000 contractors also made their way out of the country. So one of the important insights developed by our team is that ending a war results in the transformation in both internal politics within the country we're leaving and the relationship between that country and the United States. While the attention of USFI and Embassy Baghdad was on the transition process, no one, either in Washington or in the field, had focused on the transformational impact that ending the war would have. In Iraq, the lead for political engagement had long been the embassy's responsibility, and as a result was not included formally in the transition process. However, the fact that political tasks were delinked from the transition process had unintended consequences. For example, the transition plans failed to identify and assign measures to support this critical component of the overall mission, which may have contributed to the U.S. failure to anticipate the full effects of the rapid withdrawal of U.S. forces on the already fragile Iraqi political arena. Because, as many people will recall, the day after the last soldier departed, a prosecuting judge in the Interior Ministry personnel precipitated one of Iraq's most significant political crises by issuing an arrest warrant for Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi, causing Hashimi to flee and other Sunni leaders to boycott the Iraqi political institutions for a time. While it's not possible to know what would have happened had we not left so quickly, the dramatic political events that immediately followed the departure were sobering reminders of the limitations of the transition. So what then are the lessons from our study? And to set the stage for the discussion, I would highlight just a few of the specific findings. First and most importantly, as you have already figured out, we conclude that the Iraq experience illustrates that transition from a U.S. presence dominated by a major military command to one managed by a U.S. embassy is not just a matter of scale, but also of kind. The Iraq transition was led primarily by the field. USFI and the embassy identified the tasks to transition and the issues to be resolved, and Washington responded with guidance. Mismatches between objectives and available resources emerged only slowly and fitfully. In our view, in the future, such transition should begin instead in Washington with a multi-agency planning process under the direction of the White House and beginning well in advance of the anticipated transition. In contrast to Iraq, it actually appears that such a planning process is underway for Afghanistan. Second, transition planning in the field should be based on the details. Should start similarly several years ahead of any deadline, led jointly by a general officer and a senior civilian, and supported by staff, none of whom have actually any operational responsibilities. And effective transition must be based on seamless civilian-military cooperation. The civil-military cooperation in Iraq leading to the transition was actually very good. And this was a major reason, in our view, that the transition went as smoothly as it did. The cooperation was due in large part to the commitment of Ambassador Jim Jeffrey and Commanding General Lloyd Austin to take all the key decisions together, and they demanded comparable cooperation from their subordinates. A third conclusion is that policymakers should secure support from relevant congressional committees on the nature and likely costs of an enduring civilian-led mission well in advance of the departure of military forces. After the U.S. military's departure, Embassy Baghdad, in particular, needed to be able to carry out functions that were taken, would be like no other embassy in the world. But in the Iraq transition, congressional committees consistently rejected many of the administration's requests for increased funding to support expanded civilian operations. In retrospect, congressional committees appeared to have correctly anticipated U.S. and Iraqi domestic constraints on the U.S. post-transition role better than the administration or the Baghdad planners did. Finding the right balance for the embassy in Afghanistan will similarly be crucial. Fourth, policymakers and transition planners should initiate work early with the host nation to identify all parties' post-transition requirements and perspective. A frank dialogue on the scope and function, a frank dialogue with the Iraqis on the scope and function of the U.S. presence after the transition should have begun as soon as possible. And for a variety of political and practical reasons, such consultations were actually not systematically undertaken. But such a discussion does seem to be front and center in our relations with Afghanistan. We thought that it would be important for military planners to make institution building a priority with the progress that they make through training. The U.S. military training and advisory mission in Iraq dedicated significant effort on individual and small unit skills, but much less emphasis on creating institutional capacity that would ensure the continuation of this training by the Iraqi security forces after the U.S. departure. While there are some success stories, at the time of the transition, all ISF elements had serious institutional deficiencies in their training and sustainment capabilities, which are now coming out. Finding a way to assist the Afghans to address such institutional logistical challenges will be key to success there too, but likely even harder given lower levels of education, infrastructure, and the inherent difficulties of the Afghan geography. Seventh, for the U.S. military today, contractors of various sorts are essential to operations, and their successful transition is also important. We recommend that in future transitions, policymakers establish a single office to manage all contracts and contractors in theater. I noted the importance of working with the host country early and often on transition plans. This advice is also relevant to the role of contractors. In the Iraq transition, from the start, planners working on the embassy had envisaged a large role for contractors once the U.S. military forces had left. Yet there was little engagement with the Iraqis on those plans. And as a result, after January 1, 2012, the embassy encountered a host nation surprised by and resistant to contractors on the skill that we had envisaged. In our study, we also learned that any transition should include a systematic knowledge management aspect to ensure that all the databases, files, contact reports, and so forth are accessible to follow-on civilian missions. In Iraq, the transition belatedly but thoroughly embraced this idea, thereby ensuring that future generations of civilians will have the benefit of operational access to all the military's files. These lessons should be applied in Afghanistan as well. Now, we think anyone looking at the Iraq transition would be struck by the fact that it was affected by the decision to push was affected by the choice to push decisions to the right in order to preserve flexibility. That was to preserve flexibility for a possible follow-on presence. A more gradual departure of U.S. forces may have helped with the many logistical challenges that arose in the final months and may also have minimized the power vacuum. These considerations will be important in Afghanistan as well. Making a decision to go to war is profound. Wars often change a country's internal political, social, and economic dynamics and affect both regional and international security. How a war is fought will contribute to the post-war security environment. Perhaps the most important part of a war then is how it ends, for it sets the stage for what will follow. Despite the importance of understanding how wars end, the topic, in our view, has received very little attention from historians, social scientists, and military strategists compared to other phases of war. So as our final recommendation, we concluded that DoD, the broader national security community, and academia should undertake more research and analysis, including the development of joint doctrine that focuses on the strategic and operational aspects of how wars end. Our book ends with an afterword, covering some of the developments that have taken place in Iraq following the departure of U.S. military forces. We found that despite the political, operational, bureaucratic, and fiscal challenges, in the overall, Embassy Baghdad was actually well set up to undertake its primary diplomatic missions once our forces had left. And almost 2 years later, despite political upheavals and hardships, the embassy continues to manage a multifaceted bilateral relationship. For its part, Iraq began its post-transition era with a raucous political system, an uneven security force structure, a growing economy, which in part reflects the contributions that Americans and other coalitions have made since 2003. But the Iraqi people and their elected representatives face a wide range of challenges in the years ahead, a task made much more difficult by the internal struggle for power among competing groups and factions, high levels of corruptions, acquiescence to Tehran on some issues affecting internal politics, and an unwillingness on the part of political leaders of all sides to address critical issues. The spillover effects of the devastating conflict in Syria are also continuing to confront the Iraqi government with new and grave challenges, as Iraqi Sunni refugees who fled to Syria to escape the civil war are now returning back to their homeland and joined by new refugees from Syria itself. We are seeing, as a result, sharply higher levels of violence within Iraq. The effect of Syria could yet be to re-inspire a full-fledged insurgency in Iraq. So while the war in Iraq is over for the United States, it is not over for the Iraqis. But overall, and with U.S. assistance, Iraq has earned an opportunity for a sovereign and stable future. It has many of the tools necessary to maintain internal security and a foundational basis for external defense. In the near future, Iraq will continue to face daunting problems. But in the longer run, an Iraq that has a government that is answerable to its people and has an economy that is capable of continued growth and social development is an Iraq that can realize its extraordinary potential. So that's the summary of our book. Here it is in hard copy. It is available in full text in PDF and ebook format from the RAND website, and or you can order hard copies from us or from Amazon. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tara for our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I see the book? Thanks a lot. Well, thank you for coming. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes. First of all, I want to recommend the book. It is long, I won't lie to you, but it's very interesting. It has a lot of detail in it, and of course it has a great plot and strong characters. We're going to arrange the panel today so that the panelists will both make some opening remarks, and I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to your questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. And I am certainly outranked on the panel, but I'm the moderator, so I will be quite savage in enforcing a time limit. I would like first to ask Major General Jeff Buchanan to make a few remarks.
Thanks, Tara. I appreciate that. It's a great honor for me to be here today, and it was one of the highlights of my life to serve in Iraq and actually to participate in this process of the transition of my last tour in Iraq. I'd like to start and end, and I'll keep my comments brief, but I'd like to start and end with a personal anecdote. In the spring of 2010, I was about 7 months back home from my third tour in Iraq, and I got a phone call. And the person on the other end of the line asked me if, or they told me that I was being considered to be the U.S. Forces Iraq J9. And they wanted to know if I was okay with that. And of course I said, sure, I'll do that. What's the J9? And they said, well, the J9 is a person who works very closely with the embassy and represents the military on all things oil, water, electricity, development of economic capacity, agriculture, plus works on strategic communications. Oh, and by the way, you serve as a spokesman for the command. And I said, are you sure you have the right guy here? And, in the end, I don't know if they had the right guy. But I've got to tell you, it was one of the highlights of my life to serve that last 17 months with U.S. Forces Iraq in the country, in which I grow to know and love over so many previous tours. In the summer of 2010, we faced an incredibly complex set of transitions, and I won't reiterate what Ambassador Reese already described, but we knew we had to close a number of bases. At the height of the war, we had 505 U.S. bases, and we had to bring those down to 0, or we had to transform them or transition them to U.S. Mission Iraq Control. We had to redeploy a lot of equipment. He mentioned 1.8 million pieces of equipment, 41,000 vehicles. We still had, at the start of Operation New Dawn, on the 1st of September of 2010, we still had 50,000 troops in the country. And what is sometimes forgotten is that we had a lot of tasks that the military had to lead on. More than 1,100 tasks that the military had been accomplishing over the past 7 or 8 years at that point in time. And we had to decide what we were going to do with all of those. And so part of this transition process was to decide, were we going to transform these tasks? Were we going to ensure that U.S. Central Command was going to take responsibility for some of them? Were we going to terminate the tasks, or were we going to pass them to the embassy? So we had a lot of tough transitions. Our Chief of Staff at the time, Major General Burt Garrett, understood how critical this was. Oh, and by the way, all those transitions had to happen in a combat environment where the enemy certainly had a vote. But our Chief of Staff understood how important this was. And he drew on what I think is one of the military's greatest strengths, which is the fact that we're very self-critical and we tend to be learning organizations. And so he knew that we were going to have to learn a lot through this process, and that we could potentially afford the opportunity to others to learn from what we did well and also what we did not so well. And he sought permission and then got approval to actually ask RAND to come in and partner with us and study our efforts. And so I want to thank RAND for helping to make us better through that transition process, and then also everything that you've captured along the way. I think that you've helped inform us all, and this is a great work. And it'll help keep others on track for the future. And I think you've got to be cautious when you take the situation that we faced in Iraq in 2009, 10, or 11 and apply it elsewhere. Obviously, it was shaped by the unique conditions that Iraq was at the time. But certainly there are things that we can learn from it. And in fact, we had planners from U.S. Forces Afghanistan in bed with our staff during that transition period so that they could learn from what we were doing. And so that your efforts have already informed them. And they're well underway in transition in Afghanistan, and they went to school on what we did at the time. and we'll continue to learn from that. And so I think the book will continue to help them and others in future conflicts deal with the ending of war. So once again, I want to thank you for all of your efforts. I think that we have a great deal to learn about it. Lastly, I would just say that my last tour in Iraq, I got asked a lot of different questions by a lot of different people, but one of the questions I got asked most frequently is, what was the greatest lesson I personally took away from my years of experience in Iraq? And after a lot of reflection and a lot of thought, I always came back to the importance of culture. And I reflected back on my first tour in Iraq, which started in 2003, and how many mistakes that we in the military made because we really didn't have a very good understanding of the country in which we were operating in. And so I think it's critical if we're going to succeed in operations around the world. We've got to be students of culture. We've got to understand how others think, and we've got to understand what their values are and what's important to them. Because when you go back to some of the mistakes we made, you know, you can look at it and you can quickly understand that our heart was in the right place. But we frequently stubbed our toes because we really didn't have a good understanding. I would argue that we got better as the years went on, as we grew in our understanding. But I think if we're going to succeed, you know, the world is filled with people. And if we're going to succeed in the world, they don't all look exactly like us. We don't all talk the same language. We don't have the same values. We need to be students of how each other thinks. Now, the reason I think that that's important to this particular effort is you're taking an infantryman who had done a lot of operational things in my previous tours in Iraq and threw me into the middle of the embassy in the summer of 2010. And so I drew on my own lesson, and I decided I needed to be a student of culture. But in this case, it wasn't dealing with the Iraqis. It was, okay, dealing with the various parts that made up the country team. What was the culture of the Foreign Service? What was the culture of the Department of Commerce or USAID? And based on that understanding, I think I was able to personally be a little bit more effective than I had been if I'd have just gone in without the understanding of how others thought and what their values were. So I think that if you can apply, I know it didn't come out directly in your book, but if you can apply that same sort of thought, when you look at the people that you are going to transition efforts to, you have to understand where they're coming from, what's their frame of reference. And if you don't understand that, you're potentially going to fail because you will assume things away that cannot be assumed. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks very much for your remarks about culture. You didn't mention the media, but it's also very different culture. But that seems like a really important lesson for going forward. Ken?
Thanks, Tara. First, I want to thank Woodrow Wilson. It's always nice to be back here, and thank Rand. It's always nice to be associated with you guys. And I also want to add some words of praise for this book. It is a really marvelous effort. I don't recommend sitting down and trying to read it through cover to cover. That's not what it's meant for. I actually think there are a number of different pieces, the piece up front, the piece in the back, which actually really are worth reading just at one go, because it really does set the stage nicely and then conveys the lessons, which are all very important to think through. But it's also just a remarkable book that I know that I am going to find myself coming back to time and again. It covers both kind of the trees of the last year in Iraq very, very nicely, and paints portraits of each individual tree really in wonderful detail with a great deal of insight, but also gets the forest right as well. And it's really rare that you see a work that does both. And I think that it makes an enormous contribution and will continue to make a very important contribution in the future. I can imagine, and I will fall into this category at some point, historians are going to be wanting to look at this work time and again because of what it says about what happened in that last crucial year. And I think that policymakers and planners also need to keep coming back to it to learn the lessons for how we do it better the next time around. And unfortunately, I suspect there will be a next time around, something I want to return to. I just want to amplify a few of the really salient lessons that kind of leapt out at me from the book. And as always, it's typically the case that what you see in it, what really stands out to you, are the things that you were already kind of thinking about and kind of feeling your way toward. And there were three in particular, maybe four. I'll add a fourth, kind of an overarching one, that really struck me as I went through the book, and in particular read the lessons. The first is a point that is buried in a number of different places in the book, but I think it's a very important lesson, and so for that reason I wanted to bring it out, which is that you need to know what kind of a war you are fighting. Okay? And I think that this is particularly a problem for the United States when we get involved in low-intensity conflicts. High-intensity conflicts, we get. We get that. It's kind of straightforward. We're good at that. But when we get into low-intensity conflicts, and let's remember, since World War II, most of the wars that we have fought are low-intensity conflicts. And looking out into the future, most of the wars that we are likely to fight are going to be low-intensity conflicts. Low-intensity conflicts have two related problems. There are lots of different flavors of them, and they all, at some level, look similar. And in particular, they tend to all look the same from the military dimension. I remember years ago saying to Joe Klein, when the surge was just getting started, and Joe kept going on about counterinsurgency and could it work, I kept saying to Joe, well, it's less an insurgency than it is a civil war, but for now that's fine. Don't worry about it. Don't change your writing, because the first 12 steps of fighting an insurgency and fighting a civil war, shutting down a civil war, are basically the same. Right? The military tactics more or less are the same. Where it becomes very different and very problematic is when the military touches the political. Okay, in that political military realm, they become very different. And it's a point that the book draws out. It's something that I've been writing on in recent years, and I think that in some ways it was one of the bigger mistakes that we made in Iraq, certainly toward the end. Obviously, we made so many catastrophic mistakes at the beginning, it's hard to put this in that category. But by the end, this was, I think, one of the bigger mistakes that we made, which was there were multiple low-intensity conflicts going on in Iraq by 2010, 2011, even 2008, 2009. And again, we applied the military tactics that succeeded in basically dealing with all of them. But where we really ran into problems was in dealing with that political military piece. And in particular, the problem we had was we kept thinking that this was primarily an insurgency, in part because they used guerrilla tactics. And one of the problems we have is anytime we see guerrilla tactics, we assume that that is an insurgency. And in fact, guerrilla tactics are common to all forms of low-intensity conflict. And in truth, they're actually common to conventional warfare. Okay? Every conventional professional army uses guerrilla tactics as an economy of force at different points in time. But we saw guerrilla tactics, we assumed it was an insurgency, and also because it was the insurgency that was directed against us. And so we privileged that as the most important thing going on. And really the most important thing going on in Iraq was an intercommunal civil war among all of the different factions, which was a fight for power in the country. And this is most important, again, as the book brings out nicely, because at the political military level, what you want to do to properly end an insurgency, to support a counterinsurgency campaign, is to legitimize and empower the government. Okay? And in the case of a civil war, that's the last thing that you want to do. Literally, it is the last thing that you want to do. You need to limit the power of the government, because in a civil war, the government is a prize over which all of the factions compete. And once one faction gains control of the government, they invariably try to use it as a stick, as a club, to beat their rivals up. Okay? And by trying to empower the government, you wind up empowering whichever group grabs control of it. And I think it's a nice lesson that the book brought out, one that I wish that we had paid more attention to and need to think about going forward. Second point, advanced planning. The book brings this out over and over again. It is so critically important. And I'd put it this way. The problem with these kinds of wars, the problem with pretty much all wars, is that when an issue finally becomes salient, it's typically too late to really do something about it. Certainly it's too late to do something about it easily. And again, this is something that you see over and over again. I'll tell a quick story just because Jeff is sitting right next to me. But I can remember when Jeff was in charge of the J9 doing some absolutely superb work looking at Iraqi public opinion at the end of the war and about how Iraqis felt about American support beyond the security agreement, beyond the American troop presence, and whether they wanted it. And what was so fascinating about it was that it was showing, basically, if you ask the Iraqis, do you want a big American aid package moving forward and a big American presence to implement it, the answer was no. But the moment that you asked Iraqis, do you want help with education? Do you want help with agriculture? Do you want help with governance? Yes, 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 all across the board. Okay, and it really broke things down in a way that others really hadn't thought about doing. And I can remember the J9 running around trying to get people to understand that there actually really was a great deal of Iraqi support for this kind of a mission going forward. And the problem was, by that point in time, it was too late. The government had moved on, and we didn't do nearly as much as we possibly could have. And here, the last point I just make is that, you know, we always have to remember that we have our maximum leverage when we are going in and when we are putting forces into a country. And the problem is, as we're coming out, we're immediately losing leverage. And that's the worst time to be striking these deals and to be trying to put things in place. And I think the book does a very nice job of talking about why it is so hard to do some of this advanced planning. But I think some of it is really simple. It's just kind of the tyranny of the inbox. The right time to have really started thinking about a SOFA and a follow-on, a security framework agreement, strategic framework agreement, really was at the kind of beginning and height of the surge. And I think that if you had gone to David Petraeus at that point in time and said, we need to go to the Iraqis with a status of forces agreement, a follow-on agreement, maybe a 10-year agreement, I think he would have looked at you and said, I gotta secure Fallujah this afternoon. Okay, if I can secure Fallujah this afternoon, then I'm going to go to Ramadi. Okay, and in a few months, if I've secured all the towns of the Tigris-Euphrates valleys, then you can come and talk to me about a SOFA. But right now, I got to secure Fallujah, and if I can't secure Fallujah, everything you're talking about is irrelevant. But that's what makes it so hard. Last big lesson, and then I'll wrap up, which is this point about process that I think the book brings out over and over and over again. I've been thinking about this for a while because, we folks in Washington, we get obsessed with process. And nobody else in the country understands why we are so obsessed with this, and they think that we're all navel-gazing. And for a number of years, I've been asking myself the question, are we all just navel-gazing? And I've actually come to the conclusion that, bizarrely, this is one of those issues where I think we're actually right about things. I mean, it's not just navel-gazing. And the lesson that I've taken from my experience in government, both on the intel and the policymaking side, from my exposure to things like our involvement in Iraq over the years, is that process is really important because good process is not a guarantee of good policy, but bad process is a guarantee of bad policy. Okay? And you see this in the Iraq War time and time again. When we don't get the process right, the policy is impossible to get right. And just one last point about that is part of the process has to be dealing with allies. It's really painful. And again, it's something that really stood out to me during my time at the NSC, where I can remember trying to put together policies toward Iraq or toward Iran. And the problem is, and it goes back to points that Jeff was making earlier, it is so hard to get all of the pieces of the U.S. government to agree on anything. It requires so much blood, sweat, and tears to get the U.S. government to agree on anything collectively that once you finally get whatever that final compromise package is, the policy that you're going to go forward with, the last thing you want to do is then go to our allies and say, all right, what do you guys think? Okay, and open the whole thing up again and have to deal with them and all of their processes. And I think there is a tendency to just say, okay, if state, defense, the intel community, AID, the White House, the vice president, the Congress, agriculture, whoever else is involved, if we can all agree on it, fine. Our allies are just going to do what we tell them to. And of course, that's not a very good way to do things. And I can remember an instance when Charlie and I were both in Baghdad doing one of these joint campaign plan assessment teams, and we had the entire mission laying out all of the things that we're doing, this 11,000 missions that Jeff was talking about. And one of us had the temerity to say, how does this mesh with the Iraqi plan? And we got blank stares back from the mission team along the lines of, we're not sure the Iraqis even have a plan. And of course, the Iraqis didn't have a plan because we didn't tell them that they needed to have a plan or help them put that plan together. And obviously that was a problem. All right, just in conclusion, I think the last thing that we need to remember about all of this, and again, I think the book brings this out really nicely, but it's worth making very clearly, that this is really hard. Okay, war termination is really hard. Okay, as I was thinking about this over the weekend, I'm hard-pressed to think of too many countries in the modern era who got war termination right. Okay? There have been some occasions when I think that the United States did it. Obviously, World War II is the example we all point to. But I'm hard-pressed to think of too many beyond that. Even the Gulf War had very big problems. And for those who are interested, my friend Gideon Rose's book, How Wars End, is superb on all of this stuff, including the mistakes we made there. But it's not like other people did much better. Okay? The Soviets did miserably in terms of war termination in Afghanistan. And if you want to throw in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they did just as badly there. Versailles, anybody remember that? The war to end all wars, of course, was followed by famously in David Fromkin's line, the peace to end all peace. Another disastrous exercise in war termination. Even our friends, the Israelis, after 1967 and 1982, their war termination efforts ultimately proved to be just the beginning of new problems and new conflicts for them. So it's very, very hard to get war termination right. And the lesson I take from that is that when we think about war termination, we need to think about more resources and lower expectations. That's the way that you get some kind of a good outcome. But of course, the problem is that's the exact opposite of how democracies are always determined to fight wars. Fewer resources, higher expectations. We are going to bring democracy to the world in every war we fight. And we're going to do it with, a quart of WD-40 and a rusty screwdriver. And that's all we need for it. Okay? And so there's a very big problem. But I think that as Iraq illustrated better than any other war that we fought, we need to be very honest going in to any war about what it's going to take to achieve success there, and that it's probably going to take more than we want to believe. Because I think what Iraq demonstrates is that any time that you prepare only for the best case, you're probably going to get the worst case. And if you are prepared for the worst case, well, you may not get the best case, but you certainly will get a better case.
Thank you. You're very articulate and quotable, which is appreciated. And also, there were some nice blurbs for your book, I noticed.
I noticed that.
I'd like to ask our other panelists, if you want to respond to that, what some of your remarks. It was a very interesting assessment of counterinsurgency and also of the insurgency that was going on. Does that sound right to you? I mean, you fought the war.
Well, I think there's great wisdom in a lot of what Ken said. Let me jump on one of the recommendations of the book that I actually I don't personally agree with.
Good.
And it has to do with a description of when Ambassador Reese was talking about we had delayed decision making towards the end. And if you remember, the president actually made the announcement in October of 2011 that we are not going to have a follow-on force, and that actually drove us to have numerous logistical sort of problems based on what's been described in the book as a waterfall. And what I would say is that actually going back to 2010, we had planned to have that waterfall all along. And we had a very specific reason. Part of it you alluded to, which was to preserve options. I mean, we knew that we had to close bases at a fairly regular pace. And we knew that we had to redeploy equipment because we were going to have a no kidding physical problem if we didn't keep moving all this equipment out of the country. But we wanted to preserve our troop levels for as long as we could. And part of the reason was to preserve options for those decision makers. Mm-hmm. There was another very important reason. And that was the longer we kept our troop levels high, the more we could get done with our partners in the Iraqi security forces. Because if we started drawing our troops down quicker, we would very quickly turn into forces that were concentrating mostly on protecting ourselves. But we knew if as we redeployed equipment and as we closed bases, if we kept our troop levels fairly constant until the last possible moment, then we could get a lot more done with professionalization of the security forces, which I think in retrospect, we did more. That doesn't mean that we got it done to the level that we'd all be satisfied, because if we continued to operate there, the longer we would stay, the more we could get done. But I just wanted to respond to that one.
Yeah,
piece.
can I accept that completely, that it wasn't just the fact that that the waterfall was so steep wasn't an unmitigated harm, in that you did have more people doing more training for longer, maybe 4 or 5 months longer than you would have had you made the waterfall more gradual. The reason we reached this conclusion in the report, and it was a matter we debated internally as well, was that we thought that because the waterfall or the withdrawal was so sharp, it aggravated the political effect of our departure. That is to say, suddenly we were, at the beginning of October, we had 50,000 troops in country, and at the beginning of January, we had none. And that was a very dramatic change, and that it had an effect on Iraqi politics, which, back to Ken's description of the war, was the war. I mean, that was what we were dealing with. And because, ironically enough, the one thing we didn't transfer was political responsibility for politics, because the embassy always had that. But that was actually the function that was most damaged by the sharp withdrawal. Because had it begun in March, then all players in the Iraqi context would have understood the Americans are leaving unless maybe we make a deal. But by the summer, it was really quite unlikely that we were going to make a deal. In September and October, we all knew that. And it was just a question of when you'd put an end to it. But the political effect of the departure was aggravated by its speed and suddenness. But clearly, the other side of that thing was you had more time to do combined arms training, and you had more time to help them with their logistics problems and this, that, and the other thing that was done. And if you had started to be focused entirely, job one, on withdrawal in March, you would have lost those opportunities. So it's a trade-off. And we came down on the sort of the narrative of the book was, it was the thing that wasn't transferred or transformed that was the most affected by the way that we departed, and that had we actually stepped back in 2009 or 2010 and anticipated, thought about the U.S.-Iraqi relations from 2012 onward with no troops, we would have realized that we had to craft everything we did in 2010 and 2011 towards setting ourselves up to have this enduring relationship without perhaps an enduring presence.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about lessons for the future. You mentioned people from who are dealing with Afghanistan were embedded. What are the lessons that people can learn from this experience? Anyone?
Well, I think that both Ken and Charlie just hit one out of the park when they talked about involvement of the host nation.
Yes.
It's absolutely critical. A term that used to bug me a lot when I heard this early on was, we have to get buy-in. And if that's the approach that you have, that means that you've already settled on what your plan's going to be, and you're going to try to sell it to somebody else.
Yeah.
But if you really are going to be partners with somebody, then you need to work together on the plan. And there's all kinds of obstacles that reflecting back to where we were in 2010 and 11, there were all kinds of obstacles that were facing us at that time. But obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, had we done it differently, I think, we could have lessened some of the negative impacts that we ended up with in transition.
Right. And we are seeing this in Afghanistan. I think in Afghanistan, the political dialogue that we're engaged in, and we have been engaged in now for a good 6 months with Karzai and other power centers in Afghanistan, is different than our political engagement in 2011 was all about enduring presence for the United States. And that's part of what we're talking to the Afghans about, but it's not all. And I think that has been informed by our experience in Iraq. Given the fact, and the first assumption in comparing Iraq and Afghanistan is to start with your point, Jeff, about culture. It is a totally different country. Geographically, culturally, in every which way, it is different. The only, and even the scale of U.S. forces. There are fewer U.S. forces in Afghanistan, always have been, than we had in Iraq. But this issue of war termination and figuring out how you're going to set up the relationship that you have with a sovereign state after you're gone, before you leave, is critical.
Tara, I'll just, I don't know the first thing about Afghanistan, and I make it my business not to talk about things that I don't think I know anything about. But I actually thought I might say something about another possible conflict that I think that these lessons ought to apply to, and ought to apply to our thinking about them right now at this minute, so that we don't find ourselves in the conflict without having thought about them, and that's Iran. Quick commercial message. I'm thinking about this because I just wrote a book on exactly this topic. It's called Unthinkable: Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy. You can find it at Barnes & Noble or Amazon, etc. In the book, what I do is I go through the different options for Iran. And I ultimately feel that the military options for Iran are quite problematic, and I come out recommending first the diplomatic solution, and then if that doesn't work, I prefer in most circumstances containment to the military option. And it's because of exactly the stuff that we're talking about. For me, when I work through the military option toward Iran, where the problems really lie is in war termination. And it's simply a way of saying that I don't know what war termination with Iran looks like. And I'm very concerned that once we start down the path of war with Iran, we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult situation, that it's going to be very difficult to actually terminate that conflict. And in fact, when I listen to, and look, I don't want to besmirch them. Many of the people who are making the argument in favor of the military option in Iran are very bright, very able, very patriotic people, some very good friends of mine. But they tend to make the argument based on the assumption that the United States could launch very discreet military operations against Iran, smash their nuclear programs, and that would be the end of it. And again, the lesson that I take away from Iraq is that's pretty much never the end of it. And as I said, I have a very difficult time working through the war termination piece with Iran. And it's what makes me so reticent about going down that path with the Iranians. And I'll simply say that if the country is going to go down that path, okay, that's fine. Let's start thinking through what that is going to require now, because that's going to give us the best chance of actually making it work. And now is the time to be doing it.
Thanks, Ken. You make a really strong case for containment for Iran, and I'm just wondering about Iraq. Any regrets?
Do I have any regrets? Sure. I wish I had called the subtitle of my book A Case for Invading Iraq, not The Case, or perhaps something else entirely.
Such as?
Iraq, the Bomb, and American Strategy. Which actually, the original subtitle I wanted was something along those lines, because I was actually much more tortured about the Iraq invasion than many people who hadn't read the book seemed to think. When I look back on that entire experience, obviously I do have regrets, in particular listening to my old friends in the intelligence community about how strong the WMD case was. But where I think that my work stood up really nicely, just wasn't paid any attention to, was on this issue of war termination, where I said very, very clearly that I thought that invading Iraq would be, it would be the most important foreign policy initiative of the United States for the next 10 years. It would monopolize our time, energy, and resources during that period of time. It was going to be an enormous effort. Building democracy in Iraq would take 20, 30, 40 years if we got it right at all. If we got it wrong, we would create chaos, civil war, and warlordism. It's just, that was the entire chapter of the book that nobody seemed to read.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The nuance has been lost, I think. And I have one question for you, and then I'll hand it over to all of you. And that's about, you mentioned the question of buy-in, the phrase, which is very telling. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how we're supposed to learn about other cultures, given all of the obstacles for the embassy people living in these big buildings, and also for the military.
Tara, if I can start, I did serve in Baghdad for 2007, 2008 for 14 months. And at that time, this was the peak of the surge. Actually, we traveled all over the country. I was in charge of assistance, and I went from Mosul to Basra, east to west, all over the country, because we had a very big military presence. But it wasn't just going to bases. At the time, the surge, the principle of the surge was get out in the communities, have these little combat outposts, walk the city streets. And I walked through markets in Bakuba and in Sadr City, all kinds of places. Not because I was a particularly courageous diplomat, but because the military could move me. I would go with patrols, but they knew, Ryan Crocker would go to a little store in West Baghdad, and he'd go talk to the storekeeper and so forth. And we actually did have much more tactile feeling of Iraqis and Iraqi perspectives then than we do now. Now, because we don't have that capacity, because we don't have the firepower that came with 175,000 troops, the embassy is much more isolated. But it's not unusual. It's not any different than the embassy in Libya or the embassy in Algeria and lots of other places where security is really bad, and particularly in the post-Benghazi sort of community, that's when we're isolated. But during the war, many American servicemen and civilians who served in the PRTs out in the countryside, the provincial reconstruction teams, have Iraqi friends. They know people, they've been to their house, they know their families. That is what we actually lost when the military left, was that actual engagement in the culture. We were much more the foreigners stuck in an embassy.
Tara, I'd like to say a little bit about that. I started feeling the frustrations that Charlie mentioned about not being able to get out in the streets a little bit towards the end of my tour there in the 2011 timeframe in particular. So I'd spent a lot of time out in the streets, out on missions throughout the country. I had a pretty good feel, I thought, for what was going on. And then as our task transitioned increasingly to the Iraqi military, it was problematic for me to go find out what was going on. So I actually, one comment I'll make about the media, I used to ask reporters, hey, what's going on in the streets?
We know everything.
Well, I figured you had actually a pretty good feel for what was going on Haifa Street.
Yeah, that's a bit troubling.
Right.
You're turning to us. Go on.
Right, but it was as on the military side, we started doing less and less and less, and really worked with the Iraqi security forces to take the lead on all of those things. We got less of a feel for what was really happening. So that's one thing. To answer your question more directly, you said, what can we do to be students? I think it's important to start with a mindset. And the mindset is that the way you look at the world is not the way everybody else looks at the world. And you have to understand that. So one quick story. I'll just give you an example framed by culture. I talked about the importance the military places on our view of being self-critical and the way that we approach learning. So we have a thing in the military that's really been around for 30 or so years. We call after-action reviews. After every combat operation, after every training event, we get all the folks together, and we have this group discussion about what we did well and what we did not so well. We usually focus, frankly, more on what we did not so well. We're very self-critical, and it's part of our culture, and it's accepted. You won't find an American infantry platoon where there's not a PFC who's willing, private first class, who's willing to stand up and say, here's where the company commander messed up. And here's the effect that it had. And that's okay. We encourage that kind of candor. But we do that so much that that's become part of our culture. Now, there's danger in that because it's part of our culture that has become part of our underlying assumptions about how the best things work everywhere. So go back to in 2005 and 6, I was embedded with the Iraqi Special Police Commandos. And we did a lot of operations in Baghdad, Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, Samarra, Tal Afar at the time, all the nice places. And after every mission, myself and my non-commissioned officers, we wanted to ensure that our brothers here were going to learn from everything. So what did we do? We're going to have an after-action review. We bring them all together. stand up in front of them and say, what did we do well? You might get an answer. What did we do not so well? And you'd get crickets chirping. Nobody would ever say anything. And it wasn't really until we understood, look, they cannot be self-critical. They're certainly not going to criticize their chain of command in public. It's just too deeply ingrained in their culture. And it wasn't until we really started thinking about that that we figured what's really important is helping them learn from this. So after that, we would take the commander by himself, pull him aside and say, what do you think you did well? What did you not do well? Here's what we think. We could have a very frank dialogue. And then the commander would go in and say, this is what we did well and this is what we did not do well. There wasn't a lot of exchange or participation in the audience. But actually that reinforced their view of him as being all-knowing. So it kind of reinforced the culture. And in the end, we were getting a learning effect. But it was a matter of us understanding, you know, we don't have all the answers. And if we try to import our answer, it's just going to fail miserably.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, very interesting also about how you manage different cultures. And also I like the after action report analysis. We never do that. We just move on. Do you have the ground rules for questions, or please ask a question? And also if you could identify yourself, that would be great. There's a microphone.
My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I covered for the Associated Press Afghanistan during the golden years in the early 70s when there was peace. I noticed in the brochure a lot of talk about what was taken away, but I'm interested in hearing more about what was left behind, because I wonder if that will become a factor in Afghanistan, where there's a chance of a renewed civil war, and what is left behind will become a prize.
Sorry, you're referring to military equipment?
Yes.
Or those kinds of things? Okay. We had a very specific process on what we were going to do with all of that military equipment. And some of it we needed elsewhere, in particular in Afghanistan. And so we had an effort to move a lot of that equipment dominantly at that time through Kuwait into Afghanistan. Or if we had a need back in the United States, we would move it, get it reconditioned, again, largely in Kuwait, and move back to the United States. We also had a program where we moved equipment like bulldozers to states in the United States that needed more bulldozers. So we started with that. Where was there a need? Obviously, within the country, we worked directly with the country team. What does the country team need here afterwards? And you did have things like military equipment, MRAPs, or sense and warn radars, things that we helped equip the mission with that were transitioned. And then there was a whole list of other things that were not essential for us in the military. Some of that we transitioned directly to the Iraqi security forces. Vehicles, for example, radios, some weapons, things like tanks and helicopters and all that stayed in the U.S. military. But then there's a whole lot of equipment. Much of that equipment were things that you wouldn't think of, air conditioners. You know, at one point in time, I think I don't remember how many, with the exact number, upwards of 30,000 air conditioners we had in the country. And so what do you do with all these air conditioners? Well, we could pay thousands of dollars to move them back to the United States, and there were people that were calling for us to do that. Now, you think about a 6-year-old air conditioner that you've been employing in Iraq. Does it really make sense to pay all this? It was going to add up to millions of dollars to pay to move all this equipment out just to take it to a junk pile. No, we transferred that directly to the Iraqi security forces. So we had a process for how we did all that. And the military equipment that was transferred under specific programs that are actually detailed in the book and how we did that.
That sounds very smart. Next question. This gentleman in blue tie, white shirt.
Thank you, Frank Fletcher. In the opening statement, the ambassador mentioned I believe made a recommendation that people involved in planning for the end of the war shouldn't have operational responsibility. And I'm thinking of the value of think tanks like the Wilson Center and the RAND Corporation and others. Is there any equivalent in Iraq? Do they have, or might they have, some sort of think tank that they could benefit from? What might that look like? And do you think they would be open to that? And certainly both of the organizations making the presentation today would be well situated to help them stand up such an organization.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. The U.S. assistance efforts now there are some Iraqi NGOs that have developed, particularly in social democracy promotion and economic areas. There is an effort to develop a RAND-like national security think tank that we've been actually asked to contribute to, and would be delighted to do so. But in the context of that particular recommendation, we were talking about the sort of in-the-field cooperation, the calculation of what to do with the air conditioners and the generators and so forth. We felt looking closely at the transition process on the ground, and as I said at the outset, what happened was that there wasn't a lot of strategic guidance early on from Washington. It was a field-driven process with the 30,000 tasks that were binned down to 1,000 and so forth. And that process, we thought, needed to be led by people who had no other job. What happened in the early days in 2010, 2009 was that very busy people in a war zone also spent a day a week talking about the transition and planning for it. And then the rest of the time they were worried about maneuvers and operations and so forth. And that we felt that this part of the detailed on the ground, in the field planning should benefit from a senior civilian and a senior military officer and a staff of planners that had no other responsibilities. And that would have relieved operational commanders of worrying about air conditioners, and also been able to flag up the strategic issues earlier in the game. Since Washington wasn't going to do them at the beginning, maybe they could have done them in the middle rather than at the end.
Thank you. Another question, in the back with the red sweater, I think, jacket. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you very much. Sana Manderlini from MIT Center for International Studies and ICANN. I've just come back from Afghanistan, from Kabul, and I work with NGOs there. I speak Farsi, so I don't have any of the problems of getting around that American or British diplomats do, and I was there for a week. I was able to travel all around, go to villages and so forth. And one of the things that struck me was that the roads in Kabul are just rock and boulder and dust. Right. So I said to somebody, how is it possible that after 12 years, we don't have paved roads here? And they said, oh, no, they were paved, but the point was that, it was from contractor to contractor to contractor. Basically, the Americans paid for it, but actually by the time we got down to the roads being built, they were built very badly. Meanwhile, there are roads that were built by the Russians from the 1980s, and every Afghan points to them, says, those are the Russian roads, these are the American roads. So it's very symbolic that after 12 years, there isn't even, one major roundabout or thoroughfares in Kabul that was funded with our money, doesn't work. And there is huge disdain for America. So it's not a matter of resources, because if you look at how much India or Turkey has put in, dollar for dollar, their influence and how they're perceived in Afghanistan is much better than the way the U.S. is perceived. So I'm wondering whether, in terms of the lessons that you're looking at, whether there's going to be also a reflection on the reform of how we do financing, because it seems to me that the contractor question is a profoundly problematic piece of this puzzle, and it's really doing us a lot of damage. The second thing is, where is if you want, the Atticus Finch approach to diplomacy, meaning putting yourselves in the shoes of the folks on the ground? Mr. Pollack mentioned, if you ask the Iraqis, they want agriculture and whatever, education. Of course they do. If we were there, if you ask us, if you ask people in Michigan what they want, that's what they want. Their roads to be built and so forth. We're not listening. We're actually not listening to ordinary people on the ground. We're not listening to the people who have the most vested interest in the peace working. In fact, we're kind of, we listen to ourselves, and this to me is the biggest problem of of how we're engaging. We're actually not listening to the ordinary people, and they're there and they come, and as I say, from the NGO community, we engage with women and all sorts of people. They have a lot to share with us, and I didn't hear one mention of civil society, no mention of women at all. So I'm just curious where that lesson comes into the picture. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, a lot of good points in there. I can recall that when I arrived in Iraq, we had a farewell party for someone who was leaving the economic section of the embassy, and he recalled that that morning some visiting potentate from Washington had said the next 3 months in Iraq will be the most critical 3 months. And he recalled that he had heard that maybe 4 or 5 times in a year, and that one of the problems in Iraq, and likely also in Afghanistan, I don't have much experience in Afghanistan, is that the effort that we made was a sequence of short-term efforts rather than one long-term effort. And one of the reasons we did it that way was the profound ambivalence about the task of occupation. We really, the American people, the Congress, the administration really didn't want to be in the role of long-term administration and occupation. And then, of course, at least in Iraq, some of the grandiose infrastructure reconstruction programs that were designed in 2004 with the original appropriations were designed in a permissive security environment. When security dramatically deteriorated, it was very, very hard to keep decent contractors on the job. Now, that may also apply in Afghanistan. But I think that at least speaking here now from Iraq, I think that the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, known as SIGIR, has done an excellent job at trying to learn these lessons. They did a book a year and a half ago called Hard Lessons, and the SIGIR has just published a final sort of wrap-up of all of the lessons that they've learned, and they've drawn out a lot of the problems in the way that we design projects, the way that we, going back to Jeff's point, that we decided what we were going to do and did it, and only very much as an afterthought informed the Iraqis of what we were building and why. And we never actually did them to local standards and with local input. And all of those things would have increased the productivity of the things that we did do.
Thank you. Ken also wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a point that you raised that I think is also an important one, and it goes back to the point that Jeff made earlier about culture. Jeff's probably not aware of this, but I actually wrote my doctoral thesis on how Arab culture shapes Arab militaries. And I did give copies to Frank Helmick and a number of other folks in Sticky, but apparently didn't get down to Besmaya and the other places out there. But when you do that kind of work, inevitably when you're working on somebody else's culture, you tend to learn as much or more about your own culture. And one of the things about American culture is that first, we deny the existence of culture. Okay? It is part of our culture to insist that anything going on is a result of something other than culture. Everyone else in the world gets the fact that there's culture and it's out there and it has a very important... Americans, we are trained to insist that there is no such thing. So that's point number one. Point number two is that as part of this, it is part of our culture that private enterprise always does things better. Okay? That's just our culture. Think of how many politicians run on exactly that platform, okay? How we have structured our government, our military operations, our diplomatic operations is premised on that assumption. It is an assumption. At times it is correct. At other times it is flat out wrong. Okay, and I can think back to any number of occasions in Iraq where, yeah, the best things that happened were typically the Army Corps of Engineers going out there and doing it itself. Okay, because there are occasions when it's actually better if the government does it itself, when public is better than private. But again, it is just part of our culture, and it has been ingrained in our political system that private is always better. Okay, and if one of the big things about going out into the world and trying to do these things and help other cultures, first we have to recognize our own culture and be willing to call into question some of our own basic assumptions. because they're not always right and they don't always apply to places outside the United States.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Please.
Tara, just a brief comment, and it's a response. This is more about Iraq, but clearly than Afghanistan. But I think that sometimes, we reap what we sow, and when it comes to things like projects, and sometimes we don't understand the long-term impact of our actions. So if you go back and you look at I'll focus on the military efforts rather than what we did through the provincial reconstruction teams later on. If you go back and you look at what the military did early on, especially using SERP funds and to make a difference on all these projects, we went out of our way to give the Iraqis credit for all that was going on there. And when we did so, what we were trying to do is reinforce the power of that local government, regardless of whoever that was. We were just trying to help show people that democracy works, and we're here to support your system of government. And so we went out of our way to give them credit. To the point where, flash forward a number of years, when we started talking to the Iraqis about the nature of this long-term relationship was, well, what have you ever done for me? Well, we did all this stuff. It was really us, but we made it look like it was somebody else. So I think that sometimes you have, even when your heart is in the right place and you do something that is for the good, you don't understand long-term impacts. And that's something that certainly I took away from that.
Thank you. Road to hell, right? Another question, please.
Speaking of air conditioners, I think I'm under one right now.
Yeah, we all are.
Karwan Zabari with the Kurdistan Regional Government's mission here in D.C. Lessons learned from Iraq. What lessons could the mission in Iraq would have learned from what was going on in the north? My God, to this day, not a single U.S. soldier has been killed in the northern region. What was it that the Kurds were doing that couldn't have been implicated or implemented in the rest of the country? Thank you.
Well, that's another study. But let me say, RAND is very pleased and privileged to work in Erbil for the Kurdish regional government. And one of the things that one notices when you spend a lot of time in Erbil compared to Baghdad is that that there is an attention to the delivery of services from Kurdish authorities. We've done a lot of work in health and education in Kurdistan, paid for by Kurds rather than from U.S. taxpayers. And in a sense, that's actually the best kind of development. When a country uses its own resources to occasionally bring in foreigners to help assess its problems and help it sharpen policies for effectiveness, you often get much better results than you do when you have foreigners and Americans or French or any other kind of foreigner who comes in with a big bankroll and tries to do things. As I think Mike mentioned at the outset, I worked on Haiti. And one of the fundamental problems in Haiti is that the Haitians, the Haitian state has been effectively sidelined in making any decisions about Haiti's own future. And this has happened for many reasons and over many years, and Haitians are part of the reason that has happened. It's not only because of the impact of foreigners, but because the Haitians have very little ability to invest and decide what kinds of investment are made. They're at the mercy of donors and NGOs and charitable groups and churches and all kinds of other folks. And one of the things that the authorities in Erbil have been able to do is basically for those three provinces, have a laser focus on improving the situation. And so you find that they benefited from not having a civil war, which is a huge benefit, and on top of that, a fairly limited geographic area and some economic resources that have come from their faster economic growth and some oil and gas production. And that combination has led to distinctly better outcomes.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you have any concluding remarks that you would like to make, because I think we're coming to the end of our time.
I'll actually add another answer to Karwan's question, but in some ways it's a nice concluding remark also, which is I would answer the question slightly differently, Charlie, which is I'd say that the first and most important thing that the Kurds have is security. And it's something that we have to remember in all of these kinds of post-conflict situations, this nation-building, low-intensity conflict. You know, it's the piece that we didn't, and you know, obviously this study is looking at the last year of the war, but other books are now coming out looking at other pieces of the Iraq War. It's the piece that we really weren't focused enough on before 2006, 2007 in Iraq, which was securing the populace. And the KRG has the Peshmerga, and they secure the populace. And once you've secured the populace, other things then become possible. They're not inevitable, but they're possible. If you don't secure the populace, nothing else is possible, because you do get chaos, civil war, and warlordism. And the other thing that the KRG has, and I think this is what Charlie's very much alluding to, is they have two strong, centralized, I will call them political parties, but you could call them a lot of other things too, which have control over their respective territories, and what's more, have learned to work together. I mean, Kurdistan had its own civil war in 1996, and that was nasty when it happened, but it's also quite striking that both Massoud and Mamjalal, after not too long, figured out that this was a really bad idea. And since that moment in time, you know, they got over their differences, long-standing, deep-seated differences, and they learned to work together. And because they did mostly have control over their spheres within Kurdistan, that worked very well. And of course, that's not what we have in the rest of Iraq, and it's not what we necessarily have in places like Afghanistan.
Let me just make 2 points in summary. I've had more than my microphone time. First of all, on the point that was made earlier about civil society and democracy and so forth, these are all very important aspects of America's approach to Iraq, and some of the effects that we have brought about in Iraqi politics have been not accidental but actually deliberate. We have tried to empower a federalist system. We have tried to build effective local governance and so forth. We haven't focused on those things here because, as I mentioned at the outset, our political objectives in Iraq, which include these building an Iraqi polity that is more pluralistic and can survive into the future, was not one of the things that was transferred. It was, and so this book and this study's focused on the way that the military withdrew its forces and the Iraq that was left behind. But they are undeniably important. The other thing I would say is that I completely agree with Ken on the importance of security for economic development. When I was responsible for economics in Baghdad, there was a school of thought that economic development would help security. The idea was, and we were talking about the CERP program, was we would go into Fallujah and we'd spend a lot of money and people would be happy, and then because they were happy, we'd have fewer security incidents. I think that the causality is actually the opposite. That it is really hard to get economic growth, any kind of sustainable economic growth, in a situation where people fear for their lives and their property. And as a result, they don't invest. And yes, they would take the money if you gave them money to clean up the trash, but then the next day they would throw more trash out and hide a bomb under it. So it is not that economics can really turn the tide in and of itself. It's an important component to assuring populations that when security improves, they will actually see a dividend. And so you need to come in behind. So we tried very much to coordinate the kinds of things that we did in Iraq, so that as the security situation improved and as the surge affected and the awakening and if you will, the Sunnis standing up to protect their own neighborhoods from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist folks, we were in a position to respond. And it may be a kind of esoteric point, but economics by themselves, economic tools, development, growth, road building, whatever it is, doesn't work in a situation of deteriorating security to reverse that trend in and of itself. Security must be gained through the efforts of security forces properly empowered and operated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. I lost a lot of friends over there over a number of years, both Iraqi and American, and I've been thinking about them quite a bit. And so this is more of just a general comment rather than a comment about the book or the purpose for the panel discussion today. But in particular, my last tour in Iraq, I used to get asked a question a lot about, was it all worth it? And there's sort of a short answer and a long answer, and I'll try to blend the two together and make it not so long. But I said at the time, and honestly I still believe, that I think it's too early to tell. We helped to give. I will say we helped, because the Iraqis did a lot really on their own and through tremendous sacrifice on their own. But we helped to give them opportunities that they never had in the past. We helped to give them the opportunity to choose their own form of government and to choose who was actually running that government. We gave them the opportunity to develop a security force that actually served and protected the people instead of oppressed the people. We gave them the opportunity to be a force for stabilization for the neighborhood instead of an isolated bully. We gave them the opportunity to rejoin the region as a responsible member. We gave them the opportunity to develop an economy that actually served all the people instead of one corrupt political party. But none of us should ever forget the tremendous sacrifices on behalf of both the American people and the Iraqi people that led us to provide all of these opportunities. And frankly, we don't know what choices they're going to make. I think we'll have a better answer 10 years from now when we look backwards and we see how it all works out. I tend to be an optimist, and I think that they will head clearly in a direction that is right for Iraq. But that's leaning towards the future, which I'm careful to do, in particular in that region. So thanks for having us here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again
Thanks
to
for your
Rand